Conjuring the Beyond, full exorcism. Horror that will haunt you. The Thompson family had lived in their house for nearly a decade, never once believing in ghosts, demons, or anything that couldn't be explained by reason. But that was before the noises started. At first they were small, barely noticeable. A soft creak in the hallway, a whisper of wind in a room where no window was open. Then, things began to disappear. Lucy's toys were never where she had left them. Plates shattered in the middle of the night. Footsteps echoed from the attic, though no one had ever been up there. The change in Lucy was gradual. One night she awoke screaming, clutching her throat as if something had tried to choke her in her sleep. Her parents, Adam and Melissa, rushed to her room, flipping on the light, finding her sitting up in bed, her eyes wide, her breath ragged. "There was a man in my room," she whispered. But he wasn't looking at me. Her parents exchanged glances. Where was he looking? Lucy turned her gaze toward the mirror across the room. At himself. Adam inspected the house, searching every closet, checking every locked door. But there was nothing. No signs of forced entry. No misplaced items beyond what had already been happening. The next morning, Lucy refused to talk about it. But she stopped sleeping in her bed. Then, she stopped sleeping altogether. The whispering grew louder at night. The family would wake to the sound of Lucy talking in her room, except she wasn't talking. She was responding. The first time Adam opened the door during one of these episodes, he found Lucy sitting cross-legged on the floor, staring at the ceiling, whispering in a language he didn't recognize. He grabbed her shoulders. "Lucy, who are you talking to?" She turned her head slowly, her lips barely moving. "You don't see them." Adam recoiled. Her voice was wrong, flat, distant, hollow. Melissa called a doctor. The diagnosis was stress, maybe a sleep disorder. They tried medication. It didn't help. Lucy grew pale, her once bright eyes dull and hollow. She barely ate. She barely spoke. And then, one night, she collapsed at the dinner table. When she awoke in the hospital, she didn't remember who she was. That was the night Adam heard the voice for himself. It came at exactly 3:15 a.m., a deep, guttural sound reverberating from Lucy's room, a voice that belonged to no one in their house. Adam forced himself to move, stepping toward the door, heart hammering in his chest. He pressed his ear against the wood. A breath, right on the other side. He threw the door open. Lucy was sitting upright, eyes locked onto his. The room smelled of something rotting, something foul, as if the air itself had decayed. The window was open, though he knew they had locked it earlier. Lucy didn't speak, didn't move. She just smiled. It wasn't her smile. Melissa found Adam sitting on the floor outside Lucy's room at sunrise, shaking, his face white as a sheet. He didn't tell her what he had heard in the darkness. He couldn't. By morning, Lucy was worse. Her fingernails had been chewed down to the skin. Her voice, when she did speak, was wrong, sometimes too deep, sometimes too many voices at once. They tried everything. Doctors, psychologists, sleep studies. But nothing worked. And then, in a final act of desperation, Melissa called the church. She didn't believe in demons. She didn't believe in exorcisms. But when she explained what was happening, the priest on the other end of the phone went silent. And then he asked for their address. They had expected a young priest, someone skeptical, someone who would dismiss it as hysteria. Instead, Father Matthew arrived without hesitation. A man in his 60s, his face lined with time and experience. He carried no Bible in his hands, no cross around his neck, only a small black bag and a quiet, knowing expression. He didn't ask what was happening. He didn't question their sanity. He only asked one thing. "Where is the child?" Melissa led him down the hallway, her hands trembling. Adam followed close behind. Lucy's door was closed, the scent of something foul still lingering from the night before. Father Matthew placed his hand against the doorframe, exhaling softly, as if feeling the house's pulse. His eyes darkened. She's not alone in there. And then, without waiting for permission, he opened the door. The air inside was thick, suffocating, a presence pressing against their chests like a living thing. Lucy sat on the edge of the bed, her back straight, her hands folded neatly in her lap. She was smiling again, but her eyes weren't looking at them. They were pitch black. Father Matthew didn't flinch. He stepped inside, setting his bag on the table. "Tell me your name," he said, his voice calm but firm. Lucy's lips parted. Then, something else spoke. The voice that emerged was ancient, layered, as if more than one being was speaking through her. She didn't blink. "We know yours." Adam felt his stomach drop. He could see the tension in Father Matthew's shoulders, but the priest's expression remained steady. Melissa backed away. Her breath was coming too fast, her pulse hammering. Lucy, or whatever was inside her, tilted her head, eyes locked onto Father Matthew, unblinking, unnerving. "You can't save her," the voice hissed. Father Matthew didn't respond. He simply reached into his bag and pulled out a small vial of holy water. Lucy's smile widened. Then, the room exploded into chaos. The door slammed shut behind them with a deafening crack. The walls trembled, the windows rattling. Adam reached for the doorknob. It burned his skin. Lucy let out a low, guttural laugh. Something moved in the shadows behind her, just beyond the lamplight. Something tall. Father Matthew opened the vial, whispering the first words of the ritual. The temperature dropped. The room filled with a sound that wasn't a scream, but something deeper, something ancient. And then, the exorcism began. The house was suffocating. Every room felt smaller than it should have been, the walls pressing inward like something unseen was watching, waiting. The very air inside seemed thick, heavy with something no one could name. Father Matthew had seen things like this before. Not often, but enough to know what this meant. The house was already infested. Adam and Melissa led him down the hallway, their steps hesitant. They had seen too much, lived with the fear too long. He didn't ask how long the presence had been here. He already knew. The answer was always the same. It had been here long before they noticed it. The bedroom door loomed ahead, shut tight, though no one had touched it. Father Matthew raised a hand, running his fingers over the wood. His palm tingled, as if something was pressing back against him from the other side. He exhaled slowly, whispering a silent prayer under his breath. Inside, Lucy sat on the edge of her bed, still, too still. Her hands rested neatly in her lap, her long hair draped over her shoulders. She should have looked like any other child, like a little girl sick with fever, exhausted from too many sleepless nights. But the moment his eyes met hers, he knew. She was gone. What was left, what wore her face, was something else entirely. Her pupils had nearly swallowed the color of her irises, nothing but an inky void staring out from beneath the curtain of her hair. The shadows in the room seemed to cling to her, wrapping around her frail frame, making her appear smaller, but somehow more massive. Father Matthew took a step inside. Lucy's lips curled, slow, deliberate, her mouth stretching wider than it should have. "You're too late." The voice was not hers. Melissa gasped, covering her mouth. Adam instinctively stepped back, as if his own daughter had suddenly become something else. Father Matthew didn't flinch. He simply reached into his bag, pulling out a small vial of water. Holy water. The glass was cool against his fingers. Lucy's gaze followed the motion, her smile twitching. "Do you really think that will help you?" she whispered. The moment stretched between them, the tension thickening like a fog. Father Matthew remained calm. He had seen many like her: possessed children, twisted voices, unnatural smiles. He had learned long ago that they were all the same at first, full of deception, hungry for attention, desperate to frighten. He stepped closer. Lucy's fingers twitched. Not much, just a slight jerk, as if something inside of her had pulled invisible strings. Her head tilted, almost curiously. "You're not afraid, are you?" Father Matthew poured the first drop of holy water onto her forehead. A sound ripped through the room. A hiss, low and guttural, echoing from nowhere and everywhere at once. The walls trembled. The bed frame creaked beneath Lucy's weight, and for the first time, she flinched. Melissa gasped. Adam grabbed her wrist. Lucy shuddered violently. Her body convulsed, her back arching unnaturally, her hands clenching into fists. The veins in her arms darkened, black tendrils spreading beneath her skin. Then she started laughing. A deep, rasping sound layered, as if more than one voice was speaking from her mouth. The priest held firm. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to release this child." Lucy's body went still. The only movement was her slow, heaving breath. Then her lips moved. One syllable. A name. Father Matthew's blood turned to ice. No one had spoken it aloud. Not here, not yet. Not even he had dared to whisper it. And yet, Lucy had said it. The name of something not human. Melissa's breath hitched. She looked between them, confused. What? What did she say? But Father Matthew couldn't respond. His mind was racing, the weight of that name pressing against his skull like a vice. He had read it before, in ancient texts, whispered among the Vatican's most forbidden archives. It wasn't a name people were meant to speak. It wasn't something mortal tongues could hold without consequences. Lucy's smile widened. "You remember me, don't you?" Her voice was a whisper now, but the weight of it filled the room, crawling through the air like invisible fingers. Father Matthew swallowed hard. This wasn't an ordinary possession. This was something far older, far worse, and it knew him. He tightened his grip on the holy water, forcing the fear from his bones. Fear was how they won. Fear was how they fed. He lifted his hand, pressing the cross into Lucy's palm. The reaction was instantaneous. Lucy screamed, not in pain, in fury. The walls shook violently. The room exploded with energy. The bedside lamp shattered. The floor cracked. Melissa fell to her knees, clutching her head as if something was whispering directly into her skull. Lucy's body jerked violently. Father Matthew pressed forward, his voice rising above the chaos. "You have no power here. I command you to leave her body." Lucy's body slammed backward against the wall. She convulsed, her fingers gripping the bedsheets so tightly they tore. Her mouth opened, a scream building in her throat. And then she spoke. The voice that came from her lips was not a scream. It was a chant, low, rhythmic. And Father Matthew knew in that moment that he had made a mistake. He had been so focused on driving the spirit out. He hadn't realized that Lucy wasn't the only one in this house. The air shifted. The shadows in the corners of the room began to move. Melissa's eyes widened. She was looking at something behind him. Adam's breath hitched, and then all the lights went out. A whisper, right against his ear. "You should have left her alone." Then, everything in the room went black. The darkness in the room was total. For a long, suffocating moment, there was nothing. No sound, no breath, no movement. Only the dense, impenetrable blackness that pressed against Father Matthew's skin like damp earth. Then, a voice, too close. "You don't belong here." The whisper slithered through the void, brushing against his ear, sinking into his bones. It was neither male nor female, neither young nor old. It simply was. The priest gripped the cross tighter, his knuckles white, his heart hammering against his ribs. He could feel the presence shifting in the darkness around him, circling, waiting. Then, a breath, not his own. Then another, and another. They were not alone. His voice came steady, controlled, despite the terror rising in his chest. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" A sound rippled through the air, like a distant laugh, layered, many voices overlapping into one. Then, the lights came back on. The room was not the same. The crucifix on the wall was hanging upside down. Every object had been moved slightly, just enough to feel wrong. The shadows in the corners of the room remained dark, too dark, like something was still standing there, just beyond sight. Melissa clutched Adam's arm, her face pale, eyes darting toward Lucy. She was still on the bed, but she was changing. Her body had arched unnaturally, her limbs too stiff, too rigid. Her fingers dug into the mattress, her back lifting, her head tilting until the bones in her neck creaked. Then, slowly, her mouth opened. At first, no sound came. Then, a scream. Not a child's scream. A scream so deep, so hollow, it vibrated through the walls, shaking the furniture, rattling their bones. The priest stepped forward, pulling the Bible from his bag. His voice rose above the howling, above the unnatural wailing that now came from every direction. "In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, I command you to leave this body." Lucy's body jerked. Her mouth snapped shut. For a moment she stared at him. Then, the corners of her lips curled too far. "You command nothing." Her voice wasn't her own. It wasn't even a voice. It was many. The walls shook violently. The air grew thick. Father Matthew didn't hesitate. He flicked holy water toward her. The moment the drops touched her skin, Lucy screamed, convulsing violently. The sound was deafening. The furniture around the room slammed against the walls, the crucifix fell from its place, and the door rattled on its hinges. Adam tried to move, but he couldn't. Something was holding him in place. Melissa fell to her knees, her eyes wide, her mouth moving, but no sound came out. Father Matthew pressed forward, his voice steady. "You are unclean. You have no place here. In the name of Christ, I cast you out." Lucy thrashed. Her fingers clawed at the air, her breath came in short, panicked gasps. The entity inside of her laughed, but there was strain in its voice now. The priest saw it. The fight. It was resisting, but it was weakening. Lucy's body convulsed one final time. Her back arched, her arms twisted at unnatural angles. A terrible, wet sound filled the room, like bones shifting beneath the skin. Then, silence. Her body collapsed. Melissa sobbed, crawling toward her daughter, reaching for her. "Lucy!" No response. Adam didn't move. He was staring at the ceiling, his face drained of blood. Because something was still there. The shadows in the room hadn't disappeared. They had only moved. One by one they stretched, pulling together, forming something tall, something twisted, something writhing. Father Matthew's stomach dropped. The entity hadn't left. It had just been forced out. And now it stood before them, a shape without form, a shadow that was not cast by light. And then it stepped forward. The room was silent. Not the kind of silence that comes from peace, but the kind that lingers before something terrible happens. A breathless, unnatural stillness, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The thing in the shadows watched them. It had no eyes, no face, but they could feel its gaze. It wasn't bound by human form, but its presence was suffocating. It stood at the edge of the light, just beyond reach, its shape shifting, stretching. Lucy lay motionless on the bed, her chest rising and falling in shallow, uneven breaths. She was free. The entity had been forced out. But now, it wanted a new vessel. Melissa held her daughter's hand, her body trembling. "Father, what is that?" The priest gripped his cross tightly, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He had fought demons before, cast out unclean spirits, performed exorcisms that nearly cost him his life. But this was something else. It was not just one. He could feel it. Many voices, many presences, all speaking at once, a legion. And now, it was free. Adam took a slow step back, his entire body screaming for him to run. But there was nowhere to go. The door slammed shut on its own. The temperature dropped, the air growing thick, suffocating. Then, the whispering began. Soft at first, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls. But it grew. The voices layered over one another, too many to count, too many to understand. They came from the corners of the room, from the walls, from the ceiling. And then, a voice cut through the noise, deep, ancient, unfathomably cold. "You should have left her." The shadows in the room pulled together. Father Matthew's breath hitched as he watched the figure solidify. Not a shadow, not mist, something real. A face began to take form in the darkness. Not quite human, but not entirely monstrous. It was shifting, flickering, changing faster than the eye could follow, 1,000 faces, all overlapping. The priest felt his stomach twist. It was showing him every soul it had ever taken, and it was hungry for more. The moment stretched too long. Then, it moved. The shadow lunged forward, faster than anything human, reaching for the weakest link. Adam. He let out a strangled gasp as his feet left the ground. The force lifted him effortlessly, slamming him against the ceiling. He let out a cry of pain, his back arching unnaturally. Melissa screamed. Father Matthew stepped forward, raising his voice over the chaos. "Leave him. I command you, in the name of Christ. Your God has no place here." The voice ripped through the air, shaking the walls. The ceiling cracked. Adam let out a gasp as his body fell. He collapsed to the floor, unmoving, his limbs twisted at wrong angles. Melissa scrambled toward him, shaking his shoulders, tears streaming down her face. "Adam! Adam, wake up!" But his body was still. No breath, no sound. Father Matthew's hands trembled. He had lost control. This wasn't an exorcism anymore. This was war. The shadows shifted again. The whispers grew, the air thick with unseen presences. Then, the floor beneath them split. A deep, gaping crack tore through the wood, exposing something that should not have been there. Beneath the house, beneath the floorboards, beneath the very foundation, there was no earth. Only darkness. A swirling, shifting void. A gateway. Father Matthew's pulse thundered in his ears. This wasn't just a possession. This was a doorway. And now, it was open. Something stirred in the abyss. Something far older. The priest took a step forward, his mind racing. If this thing had been bound to Lucy, who bound it? If it had been trapped here, then who had trapped it? Melissa screamed. A hand, long, skeletal, with fingers like twisting roots, was reaching up from the void. Not for Lucy, not for Adam, for him. It latched onto his wrist, ice cold and unyielding. The priest's breath left him in a sharp gasp. His skin burned where it touched him, a searing pain shooting through his entire body. The thing in the void was pulling him in. He fought back, struggling against its grip, but it was too strong. Then, Lucy moved. She sat up abruptly, her breath ragged, her skin pale. But her eyes, They were clear. She saw what was happening, and for the first time in weeks, her voice was her own. No. It was a whisper, then stronger. No. The moment she spoke, the walls shuddered. The entity twisted, the hand let go. The whispering turned into shrieks, furious, agonized. The house shook, the lights exploded. The crack in the floor began to close. Father Matthew stumbled back, breathless. He watched as the void shrunk, collapsing in on itself. The shadows fought to remain, twisting, clawing at the walls. But they were losing. Lucy let out one last choking breath. Then it was over. The silence returned. The air felt empty. The room was still. The priest exhaled, his chest heaving. It was gone. But as he turned toward the others, his relief turned cold. Adam. His body hadn't moved. Melissa was sobbing over him, her fingers pressed to his pulse. Nothing. He was gone. Father Matthew closed his eyes, gripping the cross in his hand. He had saved Lucy, but at what cost? And deep in his bones he knew this wasn't the end. Something had left that void. Something had escaped. And it was still out there, waiting, watching, hungry. The house was quiet, not the kind of silence that comes with peace, but the kind that lingers after something terrible has happened. The priest's breath was heavy. His fingers trembled around the cross in his hand. The air inside the room still felt thick, like something unseen was watching. Melissa knelt beside Adam's lifeless body, her sobs quiet and broken. She clutched his hand, pressing it against her cheek, whispering his name over and over, as if saying it enough times would bring him back. But he wasn't coming back. Father Matthew exhaled slowly, his body aching from exhaustion. The ritual had been completed. The exorcism was over. The entity that had taken Lucy was gone. But something about this ending felt wrong. He looked at Lucy. She was awake now, her breath shallow, her skin pale, but she was herself again. Her eyes, those dark, abyss-like voids, had returned to their normal color. But she wasn't looking at him. She was staring at something behind him, his stomach clenched. Slowly he turned. The room was empty. The shadows that had twisted and clawed during the exorcism were gone, and yet something still felt present. Then the whispers started again. Faint. Software like a breath against his ear. The priest whirled around. Nothing. His fingers tightened around the cross, his pulse hammering against his ribs. He had performed dozens of exorcisms. He had witnessed horrors that most men couldn't comprehend. But this was different. This wasn't a spirit. This was something older, something that hadn't been exorcised, something that had simply moved. Lucy flinched, clutching her arms. Her breath hitched. Father? His heart sank at the fear in her voice. Melissa looked up, her face streaked with tears, her expression pleading. It's over, isn't it? Father Matthew wanted to say yes, but the air felt wrong. The exorcism had worked, but the thing they had expelled, it hadn't been destroyed. It had left Lucy's body, but it was still here. He swallowed hard. Take Lucy outside, now. Melissa hesitated, looking at her daughter, then back at Adam's body. Now. There was something in his voice that made her obey. She scooped Lucy into her arms, staggering toward the door. And that's when the lights flickered. Father Matthew turned just in time to see the shadows shift. Something was moving. Not in the room, not in the house, in the walls. A deep, rhythmic thumping echoed through the house like a heartbeat. Melissa yanked open the door. It slammed shut on its own. She gasped, pulling at the handle. It won't open! Father Matthew stepped forward, gripping the cross, reciting a prayer under his breath. By the authority of God, I command you to release this house. The whispering grew louder. Then Adam moved. Melissa froze. Her husband's lifeless body twitched. His fingers curled. His head snapped toward her. "Adam," she whispered. A slow, unnatural grin spread across his lips. Then, in a voice that wasn't his own, "You should have left her," Melissa screamed. Father Matthew didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, pressing the cross to Adam's forehead. Adam's body convulsed violently, crashing against the floor. The lights exploded, shards of glass raining down. The walls groaned, the entire house shaking. Then, the laughter began. Everywhere, a deep, layered, monstrous sound that came from every corner of the room. It wasn't just Adam, it was the house. Father Matthew grabbed Melissa, yanking her toward the door. "Move!" she sobbed, pulling Lucy close, shielding her as best as she could. Adam's body jerked upright, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. Then, in that same voice, cold, ancient, inhuman, "You think you've won?" Father Matthew gritted his teeth, raising his voice against the horror around him. "I cast you out, in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit." The house shook violently. The shadows clawed at the walls. And then it stopped. Everything froze. The air grew still. The whispering ceased. Melissa clutched Lucy, her breath ragged, her chest rising and falling in panic. Father Matthew didn't move. He knew better. This wasn't over. Something had stopped the attack. But not because it was defeated. It had stopped. Because it wanted to. The priest took a slow breath, lowering his cross. The weight of something unseen still clung to the air, pressing against his skin. Whatever had been inside Lucy, it had left her. But it hadn't left this world. It had moved. And deep in his gut, Father Matthew knew. It wasn't done. He turned to Melissa, his voice low. "Take Lucy. Go. Never return here." She nodded quickly, gathering her daughter in her arms, rushing toward the front door. This time, it opened. A rush of cold night air hit them as they stumbled into the street, gasping for breath. Father Matthew stayed behind for just a moment longer. The house was quiet again. The walls no longer shook. The presence had gone still. But as he turned toward the doorway, preparing to leave, his eyes caught something. A reflection. In the shattered glass on the floor. A figure standing behind him. Not Adam, not Lucy, something else. Watching, waiting, smiling. And just before he stepped outside, the house whispered one final time, software gentle, "See you soon," and the door slammed shut behind him.